Perhaps you wonder whether I might repent for what I have told you, or at least feel ashamed of what I have done. But I feel nothing. I can still see those dinner parties when I close my eyes. I can taste the crisp bubbles of champagne, hear their applause and their compliments, feel their warm embrace. I still remember how their hair would tickle my skin as they laid on my lap, how they looked at me with their silver eyes. I remember the lingering scent of cigarette smoke, that warm trepidation of their breath upon my lips, those precious, hesitant moments before each and every wonderful kiss. I would not have done a single thing differently, even if I could have. You might consider me depraved, but I wonder whether you could resist such temptations once you came to know them as I had. Vous n'êtes pas incorruptible.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Edmonds, and I'm the editor-in-chief of For Page and Screen magazine. I'm here today with Sam Zarenmark, author of Vampire. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. Now, just to start out, I would love for you to tell me a little bit about what inspired this story.
Sure. So I guess there's multiple inspirations. I guess in the more mundane part, a lot of my short stories at this point are just exercises in writing techniques. And this one in particular was an exercise for me for parentheses and for just synonyms, basically. I spent a lot of time in middle school and high school and university being told not to use parentheses, but that they're in the English language. I feel obliged to use them if I can. So I wanted to test out how I could use them in a story. Um, in terms of the subject matter of the story itself, I guess there's two main inspirations. First off, I was listening or watching the music video for Vampire by Olivia Rodrigo. And for about the first third of the video, she's laying on a field or a stage and singing. And that inspired this scene near the end of the story where the narrator is laying on the altar singing to the people in the church. Um, I guess the other inspiration is this historical figure, Mata Hari, who was a Dutch exotic dancer who was accused of spying for the Germans during World War One and was executed for that. And recently, or maybe not so recently, people have been arguing that she wasn't actually a spy, that she was framed, that this was all just some sort of propaganda effort by the French to get over a recent loss. And this concept of whether this individual actually did spy or was just in the right circumstances to be a spy was something that also inspired me for the overarching narrative of the story.
That's interesting. It's definitely an interesting question to pose. Like, what are the intentions behind this historical moment behind these accusations? There are a lot of different things I want to follow up with you about with
Yeah.
that. I'll just start from the beginning of with something that you said. I want to talk about the parentheses because we'll talk about the frame style of the story in a second, but with the parentheses, I feel like there are a few different ways the reader can interpret it. You could interpret it as the narrator including them. The letter was sent to someone in the news could re- kind of interpret them as being notes from the recipient. They add a lot to the story. They add so much. I love the way you use parentheses. Um, I'm curious what your intention was behind that besides just, oh, they're there. Feel obligated to use them. Did you have a specific perspective you wanted them to fill? Anything like that?
Yeah, of course. I guess that maybe was a bit of a blithe answer. But I guess my intent with them is that I feel like the words that I use matter. My philosophy of writing is very focused on my word choice and the synonyms that I use, but more so than just synonyms. I guess the the meter of the words, the way that the words sound in my mouth, the way that they sound when other people are speaking. And I find often when I'm writing that I'm making decisions that reflect what I want, but might not necessarily reflect the full range of emotions or the full range of the action that I want for the character to be expressing. Um, So I think that was part of what I was going for with the parentheses. I guess also in reflection to this narrator, the narrator is someone who's expressed as a being a bit more confident. And I like the usage of these parentheses, both to express that the narrator is trying to show off more of what they're talking about, but also that the narrator isn't entirely sure. Sort of this contrast between this character who recognizes oh, I'm inventing a god for these people. But at the same time, the narrator recognizes unconsciously that they aren't actually in full control. So that's part of what the parentheses is supposed to act as.
Absolutely. And there's one I don't have the story up at this moment, but I was just reading it again this morning. There's one parenthesis specifically that I think really speaks to that. The narrator makes a comment, I believe, saying, "I implore you," and then the parentheses are firmer, like "I demand," like "you must." And I think that created this really interesting kind of dynamic between what's being said, what's being unsaid. Where is the hesitation? Where is the emphasis? Where is the power in those sentences? It works incredibly well. I'm a huge fan.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, of course. Kind of speaking of getting into the narrator's head in that way, it is also, the story is also epistolary in nature. I'm curious about your thought process in that. Why frame it as a letter in that way?
sure. And I mean, I guess as a bit of a background to the story, I mean, originally my hope was that I could have this as the narrator whispering to a guard through the bars or something like that. I felt partially maybe constrained by the use of parentheses to use a epistolary form. I mean, just in reading the excerpt at the beginning of this, I cut out the parentheses because it's a bit awkward to say. Um, but it makes sense in writing. And I mean, I think that's part of why I chose an epistolary form. But also, I think I have a lot of appreciation for epistolary stories. I think that they require a level of intimacy that you don't need to do as much for other types of stories. I guess more traditional stories where the narrator is relaying the events. Um, a letter is a direct story from the writer to the reader. Um, and there is some assumption of a relationship between the two. I mean, there are, of course, letters sent between complete strangers, but there is a connection. You don't just send a letter to someone with absolutely no connection in the way that a story can be addressing readers who have absolutely no connection to the author. Um, so I think that was part of what was drawing me to write a letter because I think this might have been the only story I've written as a letter. Um, but I really enjoyed using this style.
Okay, interesting. Um, you actually answered one of my follow-up questions for that. I was going to ask if it was something you do frequently. Um, but yeah, one thing I love that take on letters. And letters are kind of a forgotten art today. People don't frequently send letters just to have conversations with people, which is a shame. I still send letters all of the time. They're fun. But it's interesting because when the very, very first time I picked up this story to read it, we had the title Vampire, and then it's a letter format. My thoughts immediately went to Dracula, kind of like one of the most famous vampire epistolary works. Um, Very different from this story in many, many ways, but I'm curious if the interplay between the title and the format was intentional for you in any way.
I guess subconsciously, I mean, vampires, especially the modern usage of vampires, evokes this image of this sophisticated and cultured individual. Um, and I think that was partially reflected by just the persona of the narrator as this individual who's very well traveled and very cultured and very witty. Um, I guess the letter does feed into that. But I think more so what I wanted with the letter was just this idea of the personal connection. I mean, with vampire, I guess like the traditional thought of a vampire is someone who takes from another, in vague sense. I mean, I know there's blood and whatever. But with this story, I sort of wanted to explore this idea of the vampire both as a victimizer and as a victim. Insofar as like a vampire is essentially chained to people, like it needs people to feed off of. It can't just live freely. I mean, I recognize it's a bit of a curious take on vampires, but that was something I think that was more inspiring the epistolary decision.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I like that take on vampires that you have because kind of it's a mutually destructive relationship in a way that honestly makes me think back to another comment you made earlier about this narrator kind of realizing that they're creating a god for people. Um, and they have this relationship with their followers, if we call them that,
Yeah.
where they need them, but they're also needed by them. They harm them and they're harming, being harmed by them. I think I phrased that strangely. Um, between, this is a little bit of a roundabout question, but taking that kind of view of the narrator's role to these people with these people and going back to your inspiration of the musician kind of laying on stage with the altar imagery, I feel like there's a commentary between music and cults here that I'm trying to figure out how to ask a question about. But I'm just going to say that and let you respond however you will, because the question is not coming to me.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's maybe it's sort of the same relationship there. I mean, I do a lot of singing, and maybe that's part of why I chose to have the narrator as a singer compared to some other type of performer that I have less familiarity with. Um, but like with singers, I mean, we sing, obviously, and we are providing a benefit to our audience. But at the same time, we do sing and we do practice for the intent of other people listening to us. I mean, I've been in concerts where we've had 1,000 people show up, and I've had concerts where only 4 people showed up. And there's definitely a lot more satisfaction with the first type of concert than the second type. I mean, we are providing a service, but at the same time, we are asking that people come to listen to us. And I think that maybe feeds a bit into this idea of the connection between music and a cult. I mean, music just generally is a social activity, and it requires people performing the music, but at the same time, people listening to the music. There has to be some level of interaction. I mean, singing just alone is not why we continue to sing today, even though people have been singing for millennia. I mean, we continue to sing because people have sung and other people have listened and other people have appreciated it.
Absolutely. Um, do you find that your experience as a performer, as a singer, kind of influences your confidence with writing, your approach to writing? Are they linked in any particular way?
I try to make sure that I have some experience with what I'm writing about. I mean, I recognize that that's not always entirely possible because I do write about experiences that I don't have an ability to really participate in or don't want to participate in. I mean, I don't plan on joining a cult to figure out what being in a cult feels like, so that won't ever be something I'll have full experience of. But I do want to avoid being the sort of writer who makes projections based on absolutely nothing. So I do try to make sure if I'm writing, I'm either writing about something I know about or something that I feel comfortable assuming about.
Mhm. That makes a lot of sense. I definitely don't recommend anyone listening to this podcast or otherwise join a cult just to write about a cult. Not a great game plan. Um, with with writing about experiences you have with writing about historical figures like this, do you have any themes that you find yourself returning to, any subject matter that you enjoy to write about more than others?
Sure. I mean, I think when I first started writing, I was very interested in writing about the 20s and the 30s. I mean, this was a time period that I'd spent a lot of time studying at university, and it felt the subject matter came to me more easily. I mean, there were episodes of history or historical phenomena that I realized I wanted to write about. But I guess more recently, I've been drifting towards the second half of the 20th century, especially during the Cold War. And I think that comes from a desire to be able to write allegorical stories connecting to the modern world in some way, in the sense that the Cold War really is just the ancestor of modern times. Um, but then B, almost by contrast, I feel like the Cold War was almost very different from now insofar as that there was a reliance on dichotomies, true or false, that made life a bit easier to some extent. Um, I guess in this story, for example, it's very much drawn. There's this dichotomy that's drawn between did they do it, did they not do it, and the narrator brings up at the end that there is a third option that maybe it's somewhere in the middle. But the story itself is driven by this idea that you either are for the US or against the US, or you're for the Soviets or against the Soviets, or you're a parasite for other people, or they're leeching off of you. And I think that's part of why this Cold War era has been driving my interest more recently, because I can write about stuff like that.
I love that approach of kind of questioning where the gray areas are when people are so used to thinking that everything in black and white for that time period. That makes a lot of sense. I think that works really well. When you're writing historical pieces, how much emphasis do you put on research? Is that something you start out with? Is that something you kind of pick up along the way? How do you come about that?
I guess I generally am writing about a time period that I'm familiar with, so I don't necessarily have to do that much background information. Research. I will do a lot of research into lifestyle decisions, word choices sometimes, clothing choices, hairstyles, things to try to make the story feel more real and in depth. I mean, my philosophy with writing historical fiction is that it needs to feel like modern fiction, just with different aesthetical choices. I mean, we live through history, not necessarily acknowledging that there is history going on around us. We live our daily lives. So I try to have my stories reflect that in the same way, that there are features that allow you to identify that this is not from our time period and instead is reflecting a different time period. Um, but not anything flashy. Like I don't usually like say the year, or like say like, oh, this big event is happening or something. I just try to leave like little tips to indicate what year it is.
hmm Absolutely. And I think that we see that approach, or that very much emulates the approach to writers who are writing within their time period, so to speak. It makes me think of Mrs. Dalloway, which is a very random comparison to this story. I am aware of that. Um, but the kind of acknowledgement that there's war going on, that there's these huge social crises happening, um, but that's not central to the plot. So they're just kind of we're aware of them through little details that happen, little things in the setting. It's not announced. So I really love your approach of writing about these time periods as if you were living through them, because you're right, we don't really acknowledge, especially not in creative writing, historical events that happen within our contemporary time period in that way. So it makes it more natural is not the word that I want to use, but that's the word that comes to mind. um, Makes it more believable, I guess, for lack of a better word. So yeah, I think it works well. um, Now, do
Thank
you
you.
yeah, sorry. Do you work exclusively in prose, or do you like to experiment with, sorry, other forms of writing?
I've tried other forms. I mean, I started off writing poetry in middle school, and that's I think I only transitioned over to short stories at the end of high school or at the beginning of college. Um, I've I've tried writing a screenplay once also, which was sort of half story, half screenplay. It was a bit uncomfortable, but I did like how it turned out. Um, I find short stories, I think, to be a good middle ground for me, though, right now, because I struggle a bit, or not really struggle, but with poetry, I feel more confined. I feel like I need to write something that's a bit shorter. I don't want to write like an epic like Beowulf or something. I want to write something quick. And when I do that, I feel like I'm not necessarily able to flesh out a full um, the group of characters, a full plot, full storyline in the way that I could with a short story. But then looking at things like writing a novel, for example, that's feels like a marathon to me, and I don't necessarily have the endurance to do that yet. And then with screenplays, I something that I really do not like writing at this time is writing dialogue. And actually, that might have been why I also chose to write a letter because I could avoid writing dialogue. But yeah, I mean, I think that's why short stories has been where I've been sticking to so far.
Understandable. I completely understand the aversion to dialogue at times. It's a mess sometimes to get done. Um, I will say, I will plug our magazine again. If you want to send us your screenplay, we'd be happy to read it. Um, but that's an
Yeah.
aside. Um, but yeah, that's interesting. I obviously with the kind of scope of our magazine, we get to talk to a lot of people who write both prose and screenplays. We don't really do poetry here, so unfortunately, we don't get to talk to too many poets. Um, but it's interesting to kind of hear how you've approached it because everybody approaches script writing differently, and everybody has their points that they really enjoy and points that they really don't. Um, it's interesting to me how can I phrase this? There's kind of this inherent connection between epistolary writing and the potential for a screenplay in my mind, and this might just be me. They're very similar in that we can only see so much. A lot. Well, I guess they're similar in that they're opposite. That doesn't make sense, but um, with epistolary writing, you get inside of the character's head and you see only how they speak, only how they write, how they know, how they tell their story. It's kind of the opposite with script writing. So I guess when I said they were similar, I was lying. It's kind of the opposite of script writing, where you get to know everything external and you don't really get to know anything that's inside of their head unless they say it in dialogue. Um, I don't know where I'm going with this. I apologize.
I guess I can see actually some similarities. I mean, just something I was thinking of, not necessarily in the way that you think about what's going on inside the character's head, but something that came to mind for me when I was writing this story was that with a letter, your letter writer is confining the world for you. I mean, I think I watched I am not a linguist, and my knowledge of linguistics comes from YouTube. So this is a very rough explanation. But I've learned about this concept recently that when we engage in small talk with people, we are creating small worlds of truth, where if we choose to ignore something, it essentially acts as like a falsehood. So I guess like a basic example is like when you're talking with someone and they ask you, how are you? The general answer is fine, even though you're not necessarily fine, even though there's probably more to the answer. And that fine acts as a basic truth that this new world is being formed on in terms of linguistics. I feel like letters and screenplays are a bit similar in that regard because either the letter writer or the screenplay writer is creating this truth for you that is limited and inherently limited in a way that reading a short story written in a different style, for example, might leave things more open to interpretation from outside the letter. I guess I'm actually not even sure where I'm going with this. I mean, with this letter, for example, that I've written for Vampire, I mean, there are events that are going on outside of the letter that the reader is left to infer. And there's a border between what is being said and what is not being said. I feel like it's a bit of the same with screenplays, but then with regular stories, I'm not sure if the line is as clear for me.
No, I agree with that. I completely agree with that. I feel like if you get into kind of first person writing with short stories, non-epistolary short stories, then that line also exists. But if we're talking just, I don't want to say normal because it makes it sound boring, but just kind of standard third person short stories, um, we assume that we're being told the story's truth a lot of times. And you can't really make that assumption with epistolary writing or even with screenplays where everything is through a lens, a very specific lens, a very specific direction. So yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. Definitely. To kind of slight shift in question. Um, I'm curious about what your writing process is. How do you go from like, oh, I have this idea to the final product?
Okay, so I guess I basically have two methods that I use for writing short stories. So the one that I originally used was starting with an individual scene that came to mind. So, for example, for Vampire, um, the scene was the narrator singing or the altar singing. Um, the other method that I use is starting with various factors that I can use as a framework of influences. So that can be a song, or it can be a mythological or supernatural element that I want to explore, or a personal memory, or even a writing technique that I want to practice. Um, with either of those two methods, I then start writing. And for me, that either consists of just writing down little tidbits on my notes app to remind myself to add that to the actual story. Um, I like that part almost more than the actual writing because I feel like at that point there's a lot of promise. When I write something on my notes app, it's just sort of like a vague bullet point, or it's a character's name, or it's a comment, and it's based on just something that came to mind while I was doing my daily uh, errands or whatever. And there seems to be a lot more promise then than when I actually have to go write it down and I realize like, oh, I don't actually know how to write this, or I don't want to write it this way or whatever. Um, so first, there's writing down stuff in the notes app. Second, um, is me just writing down things on my computer. I use Microsoft Word, and I'll generally have multiple versions of each story. So I'll write until I reach a point where I don't know what else I want to add. And then I'll create a new version of the story and I'll delete sections that I think are holding me back from finishing the story and continue writing. Um, I believe heavily in, I guess for lack of a better term, stream of conscious writing, trying to write, uh, like letting the writing flow. And to do that, I use a lot of different highlights and the word filler in my story. So I'll use highlights to identify points where I need to go back and revise the sentence, or um, to say like, oh, I need to move this section to a different part. Or I'll use red to say like this needs to be deleted, but I don't have anything else to put there right now, so I'll leave that. And then I'll use the word filler to I'll put that in the end of a paragraph or in the middle of a sentence even, to tell myself, oh, I need to write more here because there's not enough written here right now, but I don't want to write it. This is not what's interesting me right now. So I just want to come back to it at some point when I have more energy or more willingness to write it. Um, I guess when I'm writing, the things I'm really focusing on tend to be the narrator and the character, or the narrator and the other characters, the specific word choices that I use, and just trying to make sure that I return to whatever themes that I want the story to have. Specifically with the narrator, I tend to be very focused on the tone of the story, because all my stories are first person at this point. I don't think I've written any third person stories. Um, and in this regard, uh, I try to make sure that the story sounds like it's the narrator who's narrating it. So, I mean, for Vampire, I tried to make sure that the narrator has this more proud and borderline arrogant tone, um, and is to some extent consistent, is not flipping back and forward between this more sophisticated style and slang or conversational speech that I might use in other stories for other characters. Um, I guess in terms of word choice, I mentioned this a bit in an earlier answer, but I do try to focus on the sounds of words, um, the connotations of words, at least as far as I understand them, and the meter. I mean, I really enjoy using meter in my stories. I'm not sure if I actually used it in Vampire, um, but I do have stories where I try to use meter to emphasize certain elements, to emphasize maybe the beating of a heart or to emphasize the traveling of a train over train tracks. Um, I do value meter a lot, and I think this comes from writing poetry when I was younger, and especially metered poetry. So I do try to make sure I don't waste it if I do have an opportunity to use it. And then at the very end of my writing process, I like to have friends read the story. I don't give them much information about the story because I want to see how they interpret it from a fresh perspective. And I also especially enjoy having readers who don't speak English as a first language as my primary readers because I think it forces me to make sure that I'm not writing a story that is so steeped in my own understanding of language or writing that people outside of that can't understand it. And I feel like, especially people who have learned English as a second language or as a third language or just not as a primary language, um, they approach reading in a different way. And I think that benefits my writing in the long term.
That's interesting. I've never spoken to someone who kind of has that perspective or has that kind of consideration when they're getting readers for drafts of their writing. Was there a particular instance or event or happenstance that led you to kind of take up that mindset?
I write for other publications, not literary publications, but publications that are more specialized in their subject matter. And in those publications, I try to have lay people read my story because I want to make sure that my reading is accessible or that my articles are accessible to both people in my field and people who are outside of my field. Um, and I think from that practice, I got this concept of trying to have readers who don't speak English as a first language as the primary readers for my stories. Um, in both circumstances, these are now readers who don't have a background necessarily in what you're trying to do. Um, Not necessarily that they're uneducated, but I mean, it's just they don't have other influences that alter the way that they perceive your reading. And I think that's why I have a preference for having non-English or non-fluent English speakers reading my stories.
That makes sense. That makes sense. That actually reminds me, I used to work as a contract writer for an immigration advocacy law firm. And part of our job was to translate the research of like top scientists in these various medical fields into language that the people in the court system would understand. So it was kind of a very similar approach in a way. I was taking the research, and I do not have a health background, at least not at the level of these people who I was writing on the behalf of. And kind of, it's almost translating it in a way that other people will understand. So it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. I've personally never thought about it with creative writing in that way, but it seems like a very beneficial approach, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it especially is helpful insofar that it forces you to think more about why you write in certain ways. I mean, I think having to write for readers who are not fluent in English has helped me practice writing in different tones. Because I mean, the way that I wrote in Vampire, I think was the only time I've actually written in this style, even though this is a more natural style for me.
Mhm.
In a lot of my other stories, I'm practicing writing in a more blunt tone or writing in a more flowery style or writing in a more conversational style with a lot of slang and a lot of um, informal speech. And I think that if I wasn't so focused on understanding how my writing decisions affect the ability of other people to read it, I might not be as comfortable switching through different tones like that.
That makes sense. It sounds like a really good way to kind of broaden your voice as a writer in general as well. Um, do you think that you'll kind of pursue more writing in your own tone in the future?
I think so. I mean, I would like to eventually write a book. And in regards to my earlier comment, I don't think I have the endurance for that. I think I would definitely not have the endurance if I was writing in a tone that's not my natural style. So I think if I do end up writing a book, and I very much would like to, I would have to be sticking in the tone that is most natural for me. Um, Also, I mean, the people who have read this story of my friends, they do say that they liked this story the best of the different tones that I've written in. I don't necessarily always agree. I think there are other stories that I like a bit better than this one, but I do enjoy I felt like this character to me was the most memorable, maybe, of the narrators that I've had.
They're definitely a very memorable character. And I know you love the tone that you've written with here. Um, do you ever get, I feel like intimidated is the wrong word, but are you ever nervous about sharing your writing with other people?
Yes. And I mean, I think that because I choose to write things that are very private to me. I guess that's the most, it's like a relatively basic answer of why I'd be sort of nervous about this. But I guess also I'm generally trying to explore concepts that I don't think are always on the right track. I mean, just even earlier in the interview, I was a bit unsure about this concept of the vampire, both as victim and victimizer. I mean, that's something I feel perfectly fine writing down into words when I'm just writing on my computer at home. But when I'm putting that out to people to read, that is a bit of a uncomfortable sensation. I guess also especially when I'm approaching topics that I'm a bit more uncomfortable writing about. I mean, I write about sex in the story in the same way that a Victorian writer might write about it. So I feel like it's also a bit uncomfortable in that way for me. But I mean, it's good practice, I guess. I don't know.
Definitely good practice. And I mean, when with any writing, you can't control readers' reactions. So it's good to still put work out there, even if it is a little uncomfortable at the beginning. Absolutely. Um, Another very slight shift in question. I'm curious, how did you get into writing originally? What made you want to pursue this?
Sure. So I started with poetry in middle school. And at that point, I was very much into metered poetry. I wrote a lot of sonnets. And then when I got bored with sonnets, I started writing in other metered styles that either I created or just found on the internet. Um, at that point, writing was very much just a emotional release for me. I was very just focused on writing things that addressed events going on in my life. Um, I guess also thinking back on it, I also felt like my life was very structured, which was good, but I wanted to be able to do something outside of that. I mean, I felt like I was being very much prepared to go to college, and that this sense of identity that I felt like other people were developing around me was just not developing in me at that time. So writing, I think was a good way for me to figure out who I wanted to be as a person. Then at some point in high school or the beginning of college, I started writing short stories because I just felt like I'd written everything I wanted to write in poetry. I didn't feel like I was writing anything new when I was writing poems. Poems felt very much like, I guess to use like a game theory term, like a solved concept for me. Um, so I really enjoyed starting to write short stories because I could do a lot more now. Like I could have full sets of characters and full plot lines and explore settings and just write a lot more freely than I could with poetry, where especially because I was writing metered poetry, I was very constrained by the meter and the structure that I was using. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess that's my writing journey.
Definitely makes sense. I feel like a lot of people kind of start out with poetry. At least I did. I wrote awful poetry when I was in middle school. I'm glad none of it exists today. Um, but yeah, it's interesting to kind of see how kind of one led to the other and kind of how you've progressed from there. Um, do you have any specific future goals for your writing journey? I know you mentioned wanting to write a novel, but either more on that, aside from that, do you have any specific things you're aiming towards?
Yeah, and I mean, I would like to eventually write in other languages well. I mean, I've written short stories in German and in French, but I don't feel very comfortable with those because both of those languages are languages that I've learned um, outside of the home or outside of living in those countries. And I think that my understanding of those languages is very much constrained by the teachers that I've had or the courses that I've taken. So I'd like to be able to eventually write a story in a different language and feel comfortable with what I've done. Um, Insofar as not just that it's a good story, not just like an interesting plot or whatever, but that the words that I've chosen, the descriptions that I've created are meaningful and the ones that I want. Um, and obviously just writing more short stories in general, I think is maybe my other goal. I mean, I hope I don't reach the point that I reached in poetry where I felt like there wasn't anything else for me to write. I still have tons of ideas that I've been working on, and I've been finishing more and more stories, especially now that the summer's started. So I'm hoping that I'll just be able to continue doing that.
Definitely, I'm sure that you will. I've talked to other authors who have, they're like, oh, I have over 100 published stories. I'm like, oh, okay. Which means, of course, they have significantly more that they've written. So I firmly believe it's pretty impossible to run out of story when it comes to short stories. Um, Now, you did mention earlier in the conversation that you have another piece published already. Could you tell me a little bit about that, or if there are any other kind of announcements, publications you want to talk up? This is your time to share everything that makes you excited about your work.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so this other story that I have published, was published, I think like May last year. It's called Fish Dream. Um, and that story, it's a bit difficult to describe without giving away the ending. So I guess in the most basic sense, it's a story about a man who goes fishing and is thinking about his wife and how he got there. Um, it's a bit similar to Vampire insofar as that there's a historical setting that's not really discussed. This is set at some point immediately after the end of the Cold War. Um, and I think it it was the first story that I've gotten published, and I think it did well because I think it was a story that was the most natural for me to write. It was just very much in the thoughts of this person. He doesn't speak to anyone. He's just sitting there thinking about the past, observing things going on around him. And I feel like that's just the easiest type of story for me to write because that's just what I do as a person, just A, as a student, but then B, as just a relatively quiet person. Um, I honestly don't even remember where it's published. I think it's this organization called the Academy of the Heart and Mind. It's somewhere online. That's like fish hyphen dream. Um, yeah, and I guess in terms of announcements, I mean, I have more stories that I'm publishing, so hopefully I will have an actual announcement at some point once they get selected somewhere. And then I'm hoping to eventually get a book done, but that has been a slog to write.
One day it'll happen. I believe that. Um, yeah, and do you have a website or social media pages that our listeners could find you on and find your work in the future if they like?
Yeah, I mean, I have an Instagram. It's relatively inactive, but I do try to put the links for my stories there, and I also try to post a bit so it looks a bit better. The handle is samuel.j.zarenmark.
Great, and we can link that in the description of the interview as well. I like to compile like a whole list of links for people. Um,
Okay.
Really quickly, this is just me asking, is there anything that you want to talk about additionally that I haven't touched on so far? Because I think we're down to my last question.
Yeah, and I mean, so I guess with Vampire, something I was happy about, because I don't necessarily always achieve this with my stories, is that I want my stories to be appreciable on multiple levels. We talked about this a bit earlier, I guess, when I was talking about the having non-fluent English speakers read my stories, and having my stories being understandable on a level of like a base level. But what I liked with this story was that the plot I thought was interesting. I mean, I felt like it was just a good plot, but there was also more to think about. I mean, the relationship between the narrator and the recipient, why the narrator chose to write to this recipient, the identity of the narrator themselves. I mean, I didn't do a very great job of it, but I tried to leave it somewhat ambiguous about who the narrator actually is. And then this concept of this fundamental question that the narrator is afraid to ask. Um, and I would say that this last feature, what is this fundamental question, is maybe one of the proudest of with this story, because I do ask and answer the question throughout the story and show why the narrator has not asked the question without having to actually say what the question is. And I feel happy about having been able to do that. But then I think what I'm proudest of with all of this is that none of these features actually detract from the story if you don't look into them. You can still just enjoy the story. If you don't look into them, you can enjoy the story if you look into them. So that's, yeah.
Definitely, there are lots of different layers here. I will say, um, to your point that you made a comment about trying to make it not super obvious who the narrator was. I know very little about this time period. I had no idea until this conversation, honestly. Um, so I think you did a good job of that as well. And then, of course, as you were saying, all of the different layers with the question, the things said and unsaid throughout the story, it all works incredibly well. Um, yeah, so thank you for
Thank you.
sending it to us. It was wonderful to read.
Thank you for reading it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I think that brings me to my last question. I do ask everyone this question. It's a little cheesy, but it's interesting to ask anyway. If you could give any piece of advice to other writers out there, what would it be?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess obviously I've only published two stories, so I'm not sure how helpful this advice is. I mean, maybe take it with a grain of salt. But I am of the relatively strong belief that the best writers are people who are not just writers. You become a better writer by living life. Um, I mean, I guess for me, for example, my study of different languages helps me understand the purpose with which I use my writing. The friends and family that I talk with helps me develop my characters and develop the dialogue that I don't like writing. New experiences help to enrich your understanding of the world and help to make sure that your stories A are coherent, but B have a meaning that you want to impart. And I think that to become a better writer is not just about writing more stories, but it's about going out and living life. To answer back to an earlier thing, don't go Joan Colts, but I think it's important to do things that expand your horizons, expand your understanding of how things go on around you. Do things that are uncomfortable, strange, or weird. Talk to people that you don't want to talk to, and just do all these things with the intent of trying to figure out how this can improve or change your writing.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much for that. And again, thank you for talking with me today. It's been really, really great getting to hear about you, about your writing, about this story. Thank you so much.
Thank you.